go ahead and get started here. We have a rather lengthy presentation, and we'd like to get everybody out by 4:45 or 5 o'clock. Test Ops is sponsoring today's officers' call, and instead of describing or giving you an update on our Test Ops programs, what we've got for you today is a very fascinating lecture by Lieutenant Colonel Bob Springer, USAF retired. Bob's going to describe his B-17 combat missions in World War II and some of his B-29 missions in the post-World War II era. Bob is retiring in 2 weeks from EN, where he works in the Flight Dynamics Division. Bob's been a project engineer on helicopter programs, the YC-14, the F-5E and F, Alcom, and Enforcer. Prior to his civil service career, Bob was a military pilot, of course, spending 23 years in the service. He graduated from aviation cadets in March of '44 and then went over to 8th Air Force to fly the B-17 in combat, 35 combat missions. Bob's also flown over 20 other airplanes, including the B-17, B-29 that I already mentioned, the C-54 and the C-47, for about 4,000 hours total time. So it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Lieutenant Colonel Bob Springer.
Thank you. I've given this presentation a number of times, particularly to the Dedalians, both here and at Hill. In fact, I've given it to the Dedalians twice, since we had a complete turnover after the first presentation there, and so we caught the newcomers. This is a little abbreviated rendition this time. The presentation I'm going to give is semi-biographical, covering my flying experiences in the military with special emphasis on World War II and the period shortly after the war. This is a time before all but a handful of you were born, or probably even contemplated. My experiences were somewhat typical of those of my contemporaries, and I hope to give you an appreciation of the times and the people who experienced the events, particularly World War II. It's appropriate to present this subject at this time, since this is the 40th anniversary of the ending of World War II, the last war we won. I always like to emphasize that one. I was in high school in senior year when Pearl Harbor was bombed. I graduated in February, right after the Pearl Harbor attack, and went to work at a shipyard in San Pedro as a draftsman. Took my test for aviation cadets in the middle of '42, and was sworn into the enlisted Reserve Corps, waiting for a call to active duty to go into cadets. And I came on active duty then in February of '43. Few items of interest. When I went through pre-flight training at Santa Ana, California, there were 25,000 aviation cadets there at that time. And this is during the summer of '43. That was only one of 3 basic or pre-flight centers in the country at that time, and we were cranking people out pretty fast. After going through pre-flight, I went to primary, basic, and advanced at Wickenburg, Arizona, here in Lancaster, California, where I flew the BT-13, and then Marfa, Texas, for twin-engine training. Graduated in March of '44, went through B-17 training at Kingman, Arizona, then to Lincoln for crew assignment, and Rapid City, South Dakota for combat training. And the 1st of October '44, then came back to Lincoln, picked up a new B-17, a ferry to England. Most all the crews going over at that time were taking replacement aircraft over. And Anyway, we departed Lincoln and wound up in England by way of Goose Bay, Keflavik, and then into Bally, Wales, the old North Atlantic route. I arrived in England and was assigned to the 34th Bomb Group, which is the 93rd Bomb Wing, which I think is still in existence, 3rd Air Division in the 8th Air Force. And this will be the primary period of time that I'll be talking about then. I arrived in England in mid-October of '44 and flew my first combat mission on 9 November. My last mission was on 21 March of '45. So we flew them pretty fast once we got started during that period. Therefore, I flew my combat tour during the winter of '44-45. Naturally, that winter was the most severe in many years. You always get that any place you go. It's always the worst weather that they've had in memory. As a consequence, our greatest problems, other than the enemy, were associated with the weather. Another problem, although not serious, associated with winter operations was the short hours of daylight at that latitude. Before getting into the flying part, I want to set the stage by discussing the ground war situation on the Western Front of continental Europe. I think this is necessary so that you get an idea of the area that we're talking about. Now, I know a lot of you have been stationed in Europe, much more recently than I have. On this overlay here, I've got distances laid out, and also just for ready reference, I've marked here, Las Vegas would be here, San Diego, St. George, Utah, San Francisco, Phoenix, Tucson, Salt Lake City, and Boise, Idaho. Our normal maximum range mission was, you might say, would be as far as from here to Salt Lake and back. Next, I'd like to talk about the lines of battle during this period very briefly. When I arrived in England in October of '44, the war in Western Europe was reaching a crucial stage. The ground forces had occupied all of Belgium and Luxembourg and all of France except for portions of Alsace-Lorraine, roughly from the vicinity of Metz to the Swiss border. They were at the German border and meeting stiff opposition from the main German defenses, namely the Siegfried Line. The battle for Germany was poised to start. However, on 15 December, the Germans launched a major counterattack in the Ardennes, and a battle ensued which came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. In February of '45, the battle was over, the bulge erased, and the lines were back to where they were in December. In short order, the Siegfried Line was crushed, and on 7 March, a bridgehead had been established across the River Rhine at Remagen. And by late March, the ground forces were across the Rhine in force. Within 30 days, the Allied armies swept across all of western Germany and reached the Elbe River, the agreed-to line of demarcation between the Western Allies and the Russians. So I started my operational tour with the ground forces knocking at the gates of Germany itself and finished up with them crossing the River Rhine. Excuse me, I need a little drink. I used to drink water there until I figured out what the fish were doing in it. The 8th Air Force was at full strength, and Germany was experiencing an almost daily invasion of 10 to 20,000 Americans during the day and another 6 to 10,000 men of the RAF at night. The 8th Air Force and the RAF Bomber Command were smashing German cities, industry, and transportation into rubble. The introduction of the P-51 in January of '44 and the release of the 8th Air Force fighters to pursue and destroy that same month was establishing control of the air over Germany. The oil campaign launched in May of '44 was reducing the German fuels production to a comparative dribble. The 8th Air Force was a large organization, as you can see from that run down there. And for other organizations in the 8th, for a total of about 200,000 personnel in the 8th Air Force alone. Anyway, but the oil campaign directly affected the German air operations, Navy, and the mechanized ground forces, which I'll show you later on. England was referred to as a stationary aircraft carrier. This helps show why. Many of you have been stationed in England and flying around over there can see traces of the old airfields. They're slowly disappearing, though. 15 years ago, they were a lot more visible than are today. This only shows the area north and northeast of London where the 8th Air Force bases were located. Each bomb group and fighter group had its own airfield. There are 78 airfields within the 50-mile radius circle shown on this map. There are 30 U.S. heavy bomber, 14 U.S. fighter, and 34 RAF fields in that circle. Southern California landmarks centered on Lancaster are shown on the map, and notice that Gorman, Lake Isabella, Ridgecrest, Barstow, and Newhall would fall on about the 50-mile radius circle. So that shows you just how crowded we were over there. One item I've noted on this map right here, it's a V1s. I wanted to point out that that's where the Germans were launching their V1s from at this time. They had lost their V1 launch sites in France. They were hanging them under the wings of Type 111s for our first cruise missile, I guess you might say, coming out over the North Sea, launching them towards Birmingham and the Midlands area of England, which is the main heavy manufacturing area of England. It so happened that our base right here, where I was located at Mendlesham, was in the path of a great many of them coming through. So we would see them on occasion. To get a better idea of the field congestion, I'd like to show you just a little larger scale of East Anglia. My base is highlighted here. As I said, it's Mendlesham. In this area here are the Woodbridge and a lot of the other Bentwaters, Lake and Heath, which most of us are familiar with even today. In this case here, there were 6 other airfields within a 10-mile radius of Mendlesham. Superimposed on here are some of our local landmarks here, also Red Mountain, Ridgecrest, Tehachapi, and so forth. That gives you a little better visualization of just the size we're talking about. You recall my mentioning weather and short daylight hours being a problem. Well, couple that with 38 or more aircraft being launched by 35 to 40 heavy bomb bases in a confined area at the same time, and you can start to see the problem. The only nav aids we had were low-frequency non-directional radio beacons called splashers and bunchers, very high and low power respectively. There were scores of them. The one my group used was Buncher 19, located down here but it was 19 miles from the base. And that brings up a problem which I'll get to. Okay, here's how we launched and recovered the group under inclement weather. Don't tell anyone from the FAA or they'd have mass cardiac arrest, I think. At least half our takeoffs were pre-dawn. The prevailing weather in this part of England in the winter of 44-45 was 10-tent stratus cloud with bases 500 to 1,000 feet, tops 6 to 12,000 feet, visibility a half to 1 mile with drizzle or light snow and fog. Those of you who have been stationed in East Anglia are familiar with that. Couple that with non-directional radio beacons for nav aids and the numbers of aircraft, and you really start to see the problem. For takeoff, all of the aircraft would be lined up around the perimeter track, nose to tail on either side of the runway. Feet normally taking off on the runway in this direction, the aircraft to be lined up around the perimeter track coming in on either side. 4 aircraft would be on the runway staggered on either side of the center line. There was a control trailer called a caravan which would signal each aircraft in turn with an Aldous lamp to start its takeoff rule. Since the full length of the main runway was 6,000 feet, many times the controller in the caravan could not see the far end of the runway. Therefore, an observer was stationed at the far end so he could inform the controller whether the aircraft taking off aborted or otherwise blocked the runway. We took off at 30 seconds interval on signal from the caravan. That's right, an instrument departure on the same track every 30 seconds. You were on instruments almost as soon as breaking ground, and usually before daylight. The first problem encountered was fighting prop wash from the preceding aircraft. After accelerating to 150 miles an hour indicated, which happened to be the instrument climb speed for B-17s, in fact, we did practically everything at 150. 150 was also the long-range cruise speed. It made it easy. Anyway, after accelerating to 150 miles an hour indicated, you turned to home in on buncher 19. Clear down here. We flew a rigidly controlled power setting which gave us between 300 and 400 feet a minute rate of climb. Each aircraft was flashing an Aldous lamp out the rear of the tail turret, hoping that the guy behind you didn't crawl up your ass. Remember, there are 38 airplanes strung out 30 seconds apart in the soup. After passing over buncher 19, you continued the climb in a racetrack shuttle pattern until you were on top, where we then assembled. During darkness, the sky on top generally looked like the 4th of July because every group was shooting its own color flares for identification of the aircraft trying to formate. All over England, this part of England, there were up to, say, 40 groups scattered all over here trying to assemble. Anyway, you'd fly a racetrack pattern until all of the aircraft had formed into their respective squadron formations. That was easy, climbing up through. Now, how do you recover these 38 airplanes? With basically the same weather conditions. You can't bring them down through the stuff in formation. So, you peel off into individual aircraft on top over the buncher, and then shuttle down again until you broke clear. You may break clear at 1,000 feet, you may break clear at 200 feet, but you continue your descent until you broke cleared and then remain contact. from then on back to the beacon, and then once passing over the beacon, you had this complex here with the city of Ipswich. In brown here we have a road, in blue we have a river, and green we have a railroad, which makes a nice little complex there. Anyway, that's what you did. You flew up, they hit this complex and followed the main road up till you ran into an intersection. They had a real nice pub and a roundabout. And those of you who have been in England know what a roundabout is. It makes it easy for identification. And you, unfortunately, you were coming in at right angles to the runway, so you'd brake right or left, fly a timed pattern, and then should be lined up with the runway. 3/4 of a mile off the runway, you had a brilliant flashing red light to help you get lined up. And then you had amber lights down the side of the runway, and you got in. You didn't dare go around. There's no place to go. The sky's full of airplanes. And it's remarkable. Looking back, it is remarkable that we could do it without really any big hassle. You wouldn't even think about it hardly today. Anyway, this did create some problems, so we did have a lot of mid-airs. The greatest danger was aircraft failing to get off the ground or flying back into the ground after takeoff. This was generally disastrous with about 2,700 gallons of high-octane gasoline, 6,000 pounds of bombs, and full ammo for 12 50 caliber machine guns. It happened fairly frequently. With the low temperatures and the high humidity of England, ice and frost was always a problem. Most of the time, the aircraft ground crews would have to use kill frost, which is an alcohol solution, on the aircraft using mops and buckets. Many times I saw frost so bad that crystals up to a ½ inch long would form, and that really looked strange on bicycle spokes. If it snowed during the night, all of the ground personnel not involved in getting the aircraft ready would have to fall out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to hand shovel snow off the taxiways and runway. We didn't have any equipment with blades because they had all been sent to the continent. One little item, this brings out a point that I'm trying to make. I'm covering items that normally are not talked about in the books that you read about, say, combat in the 8th Air Force. They tell you all about the flak and one thing, and I'll be getting to that. But such items as, how do we get this thing formed? And just other little items. Maybe it's seemingly unimportant, but it's damned important when you're involved in things. That's the matter of clothing. What do you wear? B-17s that we had virtually no heat. The only thing that we had were muffs around the inboard engine exhausts. All of the insulation in the aircraft had been stripped out for fire prevention. So you had bare metal, essentially. At our normal operating altitudes of 26 to 27,000 feet over the continent, the outside air temperature was generally down to at least minus 50 degrees centigrade. It would generally be 15 or 20 degrees warmer in the cockpit. I went through quite an iteration before coming up with the right combination of clothing to fly in. The problem was to wear something that wasn't so warm that you would sweat, but still would protect you if the nose of the aircraft was shot up. To compound the problem, you had to have on clothing that you could bail out or crash land in and live in a POW camp. Anyway, I finally arrived at the following combination: long underwear, turtleneck sweater, wool uniform, shirt and pants, lightweight electrically heated flying suit, medium weight gabardine flying suit, medium weight jacket or my Navy leather flying jacket that I had, nylon gloves. You wouldn't dare touch anything at altitude with bare skin if you wanted that skin left. Electrically heated gloves, a pair of cotton socks, 2 pair of wool socks, GI shoes, fleece lined flying boots, a leather helmet, and my oxygen mask. This outfit gave me good warmth with good versatility and freedom of movement. Of course, by the time I got a May West on, together with a parachute harness, not to mention a flak suit and flak helmet, about the only thing I could move were my arms and legs. I felt like a knight of old on his charger, or perhaps more appropriately, a damn turtle. Formations. We flew a vertical stack formation. And the reason for this being, this is a side view of it here, the reason for being that it opens up all of our forward and rearward guns. Most of the fighter attacks were either head-on or straight up the tail, and generally consisting of more than one aircraft. They would try to get enough aircraft together to form what we call a company front, which would be, say, 5 or more aircraft line abreast and maybe up to 4 or 5 waves of them. Generally with the Focke-Wulf 190s, they'd use a head-on attack, and as they got in close to it, they would half-roll split us out because the bellies of the 190s were well armored, and also that radial engine that helped them coming in. Me-262s, generally individual attacks. There wouldn't be that many up at one time, and it seemed like for every 262 I saw, there'd be about anywhere from 4 to 6 51s trying to catch him. Me-163 rocket ships, they used very few of them to attack the bomber formations. They didn't have much fuel. They'd make a diving attack, play their energy, zoom back up, and then another diving attack, so it'd be a yo-yo type of thing. Generally, they used them to fly down the bomber stream, scouting out formations, flying looking up like this with even slight evasive action sure leads to vertigo. And half the time you flew and you didn't know, frankly, which end was up, because all your gyros in your head had tumbled long ago. For the bomb run, we simply opened up and the elements spread out to the side to get a diamond area here, so we're not dropping bombs on each other. That's very, very simple. The wing root formation was spread out like this. You had the 3 groups. They'd be spread out in altitude and somewhat laterally for better flak defenses, so that nobody is at the same altitude as another. Once they get locked on, they couldn't just simply keep firing them at the same altitude. Just made for better control and everything. Now, how do you get this gaggle together? And this is a real fine art that they developed. This shows forming the bomber stream with all of the groups, the wings, the divisions, and then the bomber stream itself. Each dot represents a bomb group of 38 aircraft. Timing was all important. You notice I have them coming in here, and they're staggered. They come up to this point here to assemble the wing, and when they come out of there, they're in their proper position. And then they come down here, the whole mess has to be in their proper position. Timing was all important. And once they were assembling, nobody would give an inch. And naturally, sometimes they had screw-ups in their planning, where you had one group trying to get to here and another group trying to get to here at the same time, and all they would do is open up and fly through each other, and then, honest to God, it's true. We formed the bomber stream like this for control and also better fighter protection. Just show you briefly how they gathered all of this together over East Anglia. Each of the air divisions would have a certain airspace that they would form their groups into the wings, and then the wings would form into their division, and then finally the whole works would come together. And believe it or not, it generally worked quite well, day after day. I'd like to show you some of the, first of all, talk about the continent now. The yellow areas are permanent flak areas, say from September of 44 on. Of course, as territory was lost, well, they would withdraw. The first thing they would withdraw, I think, were their flak guns and the other areas. These were major manufacturing areas, militarily important areas, and so forth. Some of the most heavily defended areas were the oil targets. Merseburg, Magdeburg area, up around Hamburg, Hanover, and here in the Ruhr. These are some of the typical routings shown for the northern part, the central part, and then into the southern part. These are based on actual mission routes that I had flown. They're very clever, the Germans. They leave gaps in their flak defenses like here, and that helps funnel the bomber stream into there. If you have a choice, you're going to go in through someplace where there ain't no flak, because we didn't just fall off the turnip truck, you know. But it helps. If they know that the bomber stream's coming through here, they're going to be crossing the Dutch coast at this point here, and this helps give them a little bit better idea of where they're going to muster their fighter forces. Anyway, one thing I would like to mention, now we talked about flak. There's very few things in the air that we're flying right now that are new. Practically everything that is, say, defensive and even offensive systems on the aircraft that we have now are nothing more than further developments of what we had during the war. We had airborne radar for bombing and navigation. I had VHF radio. We didn't have UHF yet. Carpet. Carpet was nothing more than airborne jammers, or ECM. The carpet were fixed frequencies, and each bomber had that. We had chaff, which you use now. We used ferrets for your ELINT, or your electronic intelligence, things we do now. We had communications intercept and jamming. Either jamming the German fighter frequencies or giving false instructions. G, which is a short-range Loran or Navaid. We also used that for bombing. We had ILAS. Very few bases within England itself had that, but we used it to identify the front line. They would put in an ILS station, and when the needle swung, we had just crossed the battle line. Then we can start looking for targets of opportunity, if nothing else. We had GCA at emergency bases, spoofers, which are out to deceive enemy radar. We use that now. Very fast, accurate VHF DF, airborne radar warning, and IFF. There isn't much that we use right now that isn't on that damn list someplace. It's just refined. Go back to the flak areas here for just a moment. I mentioned these were fixed flak. In addition to the fixed flak areas, you also had mobile flak, generally on trains, or in some cases they were motorized. They could move them from point to point. Also along the coast you had shipboard flak. Most of the flak batteries were the famous 88 millimeter, and others were the 105 millimeter, 128 millimeter around major target areas. The flak batteries were set up with 4 guns and a visual and radar director. More than one battery could be centrally controlled, and they used both tracking and barrage type flak. If it was clear and they could visually direct the fire, you might as well shut down your jamming equipment and save your chaff for another day. If the radar fire control was required, our radar countermeasures were very effective. The chaff and the carpet and the airborne jammers did a real good job, and it was damn comforting if you're on top of the overcast, having the flak down about 5,000 feet below you or something like that. That's very comforting. But before the days of the chaff and jamming and so forth, their radar gun directors were excellent. And like I said before, if it was visual, forget it. One item